The town of Frisco, Colorado, unites a narrow, mineral-rich canyon with a rolling tri-river valley. Its location at the bottom of 10 Mile Canyon was a natural stagecoach stop. The founders bet it could also become a railroad hub. To help this along, it was named in 1875 after the famous St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, the Frisco. A railroad soon came, and a year later, a second one. They were both eager to serve nearby mining towns, hauling supplies in and mineral rock out. The rock ore was sent up the canyon to the smelters in nearby Leadville. There, they extracted precious metals like gold, silver, copper, and lead. Frisco residents supported the railroad and the miners with food from its ranches and fuel from its land. The Frisco area provided ample timber from its surrounding tree-covered mountains. At its peak, about 2,400 acres of trees were cut down annually. Most of this wood was slow-cooked into charcoal. 50 brick beehive kilns were located in Frisco next to a railway, which is now the bike path. So many trees were cut down that by the 1890s, the hillsides were cut bare. Today, ancient tree stumps surround Frisco, with taller ones cut as low as the snow allowed. Long before there was a town called Frisco, native hunter-gatherers followed migrating animals into high summer pastures. Local archaeological discoveries include fire pits, bone fragments, arrowheads, and tools that date to 6,800 years ago. The Native Americans who lived in these mountains were primarily two tribes of Ute and their occasional enemies, the Arapaho. They roamed most of Colorado, Utah, and the Four Corners area of Arizona and New Mexico.
You think about what it was like with the Utes that were here for all those centuries. No buildings, no cars, no noisy airplanes. Peace.
The Utes were one of the first Native American tribes to ever ride horses. The horses were introduced by the Spanish in the late 1600s. A few horse raids aside, the Spanish described the Utes as friendly, even providing early explorers with food. They traded until the 1700s. Western Native tribes were pushed off of their lands by settlers, beginning in 1865 with a series of treaties. Forced relocation to reservations began in 1879 with the slogan, "The Utes must go." The Utes fought back, winning several conflicts including the Meeker Massacre. This resulted in the Ute Removal Act a year later. Ute lands today are in southwestern Colorado, New Mexico, and northeastern Utah. One of the last local Utes was the 300-pound Colorado, shown here in 1887. The Utes remain to this day the longest inhabitants of Colorado. The first Europeans who entered Colorado were the Spanish in the 1600s. They were followed by the French and English a century later. They came to explore, hunt, trap, and trade with the natives. The Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803 added half of Colorado, just short of Frisco, all the way east to the Mississippi River. This doubled the size of the United States. Frisco and everything west was still Spanish territory, but the pioneers still came. Mountain men were usually young, strong, and adventurous. Many partnered with private companies for gear and supplies in exchange for half of their profit. About a dozen traveled together because the natives, wildlife, and extreme weather made it dangerous to work alone. Scouting first in the summer and then trapping in the fall after the beaver's fur had thickened. Winters were spent at lower elevations, sometimes with friendly Native Americans. Many mountain men adopted their ways by dressing in buckskins, sleeping in teepees, and a few even marrying Native American women. The wetlands of Summit County were teeming with wildlife. A local trapping site near Frisco, named Belmonte's Hole, was abundant with beaver. This was where the tri-rivers of the Snake, the 10 Mile, and the Blue came together. In the 1960s, this valley was dammed and flooded and named the Dillon Reservoir. The overtrapping of beaver for making felt hats and the change to making hats with silk kept most mountain men from returning to the area around the 1840s. The Colorado Gold Rush began in 1859 when gold was discovered near Denver. Soon, more discoveries were made throughout the state. Prospectors panned streams for gold, but the rush was short-lived as the easy or free gold thinned out. They also found silver bound in rock, but that had to be drilled, blasted, hauled, and smelted. A Swedish stonemason named Henry Racine arrived in present-day Frisco in 1873. He built a cabin and began mining. By 1879, about 100 people called Frisco home. Frisco was surrounded by several mining camps and towns with names like Masontown, Curtin, Dickey, Robinson, Wheeler, Racine, and Kokomo. Today, they're ghost towns, due to many factors. First, the price of silver crashed in 1893, partly because too much of the precious metal had been discovered. This created an oversupply, drove the price down, and made silver too expensive to mine. Towns also burned down, were buried by another mine's tailings, or were wiped away by avalanches. A few towns were moved or abandoned due to the construction of the Dillon Reservoir.
There are lots of artifacts around Frisco and in through the 10 Mile Canyon that will tell you the story of mining in this part of the county. Here, you needed a lot of investment money in order to develop those mines. So you had people going through the East Coast to the West Coast to try to find investors. Very often, more money went into that mine than came out.
The largest local mine was the King Solomon Tunnel and Development Company, who dug over a mile of hard rock tunnels into the 10 Mile mountain range. Hauling supplies, ore, and people by horse and wagon was slow and expensive. Railroads moved everything faster and cheaper. When gold and silver were discovered in Colorado, the railroads followed. They made their money by supporting mining enterprises, or as they said, mine the miners. They built railways using smaller tracks, and they ran lighter trains called narrow gauge. This made it easier to carve track through the tight canyons and climb the steep mountains. The first narrow gauge railroad to come through Frisco was the Denver and Rio Grande in 1882. It ran alongside a wagon road where the highway is now from Frisco to Copper Mountain and then on to Leadville. A competitor steamed into Frisco a year later. The Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad was forced to carve its tracks through the side of 10 Mile Canyon. This is now the bike path from Frisco to Copper Mountain. This steeper side of the canyon was regularly covered by avalanches and mudslides. Rotary snowplows were used to clear the tracks, but men still had to shovel through first. They cleared rocks and timber that would otherwise damage the rotor blades. That wasn't the only thing that would block their path. One story told of plowing through frozen cattle killed by an avalanche with the rotor tossing them into the air like flying beefsteaks. It used up to half of the railway's maintenance budget to keep these tracks cleared. Scheduled stops were often missed because the tracks were blocked. This earned the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad the nickname damn slow pulling and pretty rough riding. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway stopped service in the 1920s, and the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad pulled out in 1938.
But before they pulled up all the tracks, some men from Como in Park County put railroad wheels on a Model T Ford, put the Model T Ford on the tracks, and took their friends all on the tracks to the east to Bailey, to west toward Leadville, and they had a wonderful time all summer.
At one time, the railroad industry was the largest local employer after mining. Frisco during the 1880s was bustling with people. Main Street featured hotels, supply houses, blacksmith shops, and plenty of saloons. Frisco was reported to have every other shop without having any undesirables like lawyers, gamblers, fallen women, or ministers. This was quite a boast, as Frisco did have its problems.
In October 1881, James McWalters was murdered in a saloon and billiard parlor here in Frisco. The jury was convened. They deliberated for 2.5 days while the body of James McWalters laid on the floor in front of them. They never did find who committed the murder.
The Schoolhouse Museum was originally built as a saloon in 1899, but may have never opened. The town converted it into a school in 1901. The bell tower was added a few years later from a Breckenridge schoolhouse, and it's still used today. The Excelsior mine brought electricity to Frisco with its hydroelectric plant in 1899. The mine closed in 1913, leaving the town without power. By 1930, only 18 people lived in Frisco. The mining industry had collapsed, and the only thing left was ranching. Bill Thomas wrote letters to 100 people in Denver offering free plots of land if they built cabins within a year. Bill needed customers for his ranch, and he enticed them with the phrase, "home cooking with an abundance of milk and cream." It worked, and Frisco's neighboring community of Bill's Ranch was born. Frisco didn't boom again until the 1960s when the white gold rush came with the opening of the surrounding ski resorts. This turned the area into a winter playground. It's since evolved into a spring, summer, and fall mountain getaway and an international destination. Frisco remains a supportive community as originally intended and has its own year-round attractions. Frisco's history is preserved in the Frisco Historic Park and Museum. Over a dozen buildings have been restored and are on display, including the Schoolhouse Museum, Frisco's first jail, several cabins, and Frisco's first dedicated church.